In this video, I'll show you how to create custom forms on individual steps in a process, which of course become individual tasks on projects. With custom forms, you can really build a lot of powerful functionality into your individual tasks and processes, so your team can input data and make selections and check things off and all sorts of stuff as they're going through their tasks, powered by ProcessKit. So let's see how this could work. I'm looking at my process templates, and I'm going to go into my podcast episode production process. And I'm going to scroll down to step number 8 here, where we drop the episode recording audio file into Dropbox. Let's open that up. Now, what I want to add here is first just some quick instructions for the person doing this, and then I'm going to add an input field where they can drop in the Dropbox URL where they've saved the audio. So first we're going to add a new block. And here you can see all of the block types that you're able to add to an individual step in a process. We're going to use this description block where we can just add instructions, and descriptions can include other things like videos and images and whatnot. But all these other block types, most of these are form fields. So you can add like a text input, a rich text input, so multiple paragraphs, videos, links, and whatnot. A drop-down selection, radio button selections. You can have multiple checkboxes. This is good for setting up subtasks as well. You can have a date and time input field. They can input an email address. They can input a website URL address. And if you have lots of things, packed into a task, you can use the separator line to, better organize it and make it easy for your team to follow. But first, let's add that description. So these are going to be the instructions that the team sees. And below that, we're going to add the input field where they can drop in the website URL of the Dropbox share link. And let's rename this field Dropbox URL. We won't pre-fill the value by default, but we will make this a required field. So let's create that. Great, so now we have our description field. We've got our Dropbox URL field. And if I look at the dependency rules for this task, it automatically added a dependency rule, which basically says, the person cannot check off this task until they have filled in the Dropbox URL. Now, if I need to edit these blocks, of course, we can just open up the block settings and change those settings. We could also use that to reorder them. Now, keep in mind, we're looking at the process template, so this is not where we would start to input data into these fields. That happens later when we turn this into an actual task on a project. I'll show you that in just a minute. Let's move down to the next step in this process where we're writing the show notes. We'll open that up. And in this task, I already had this description or instructions for my team, but what I want to add to it are a couple of things. First, I want to add a rich text field, and this is where the person is actually going to drop in their show notes. Let's rename this show notes, and we'll make this required. And we won't pre-fill any value, but this is the rich text area that they will be able to write in their show notes. Okay, so we've got the show notes field. Now I also want to add a little checklist for our show notes writer, just to make sure that they remember to do all the things that we always want included in our show notes. So let's add another block for that. We're going to use the checkboxes block, and let's call it the show notes checklist. And let's start adding some of those checklist items. Great. Now I could make some of these checked by default, but I won't do that here. Just going to create that set of checkboxes. And so now we've got sort of like a sub checklist inside this task. Awesome. We're going to do one more thing. We're going to skip down to step 11 where our audio editor would be editing the audio. Let's open that one up. And I just want to tweak the dependency rules on this one. Let's say that they cannot start editing the audio until, of course, we've recorded the audio and dropped it into Dropbox. So we've already added that field for saving the Dropbox. So let's set up a dependency rule that basically prevents someone from doing this task until that field has been filled in. Let's add a dependency rule. We're going to base this on a task field value. And the task that's based on is dropping the audio into Dropbox. And it's going to look for that Dropbox URL field. And we're going to say that must not be empty. So let's create that rule. All right. So we've added some custom fields into our process. We've added some automation rules. Now let's see how this works in action. Let's go over to our boards and let's open up our podcast episodes board. And let's go ahead and create an episode. So that automatically loaded in this task list built from our process, of course. And let's take a look at those items that we've edited. You'll notice that, first of all, these tasks cannot be completed because we've added those dependency rules, or in other words, we made some of those fields required. And let's open this up. So we've got our instructions, and then the person can drop in their Dropbox URL right here. Let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to drop in the URL and update. Now, since this was a website URL field, we could just click this to access it, or we can copy the URL using this button. And you might have noticed that now that we filled in this field, now this task can be completed. So let's go ahead and complete that. Awesome. Now let's move on to the next step, writing the show notes. And here we can start to, type in the show notes. And this is a rich text field, which can take all sorts of, different stuff like, links, and we can drop in images and embed videos and all sorts of cool stuff. But we're just gonna, keep it simple just for now, since this is just a demonstration. And we've got our checklist, so we can check that off as well, get that updated. And of course, now we can check this task off. One more thing, let's look at that step 11 that we added. You'll notice that now we can check this off, and that is because we have met our dependency rule, which basically just said, you cannot check this off until we've dropped in that URL into that field above. And we already did that in step 8, the Dropbox URL field. So that's all good. So now we can check this one off. So as you can see, you can really use these new blocks and form fields to add a lot of really powerful functionality into your processes and your tasks for your team to follow. So that's the new Forms feature. I can't wait to see what you build with it. Thanks.